Hello everyone, we will look at how to create the stylized lamppost model. In this video, we will create the low poly model and the high poly sculpt. In the next part of this video, we will cover texturing this asset. Now, this part will mostly just be the workflow video and not an in-depth tutorial, but I tried to mention most of the stuff that I'm doing here. So let's get working with Blender. Starting with the default scene, I will just delete the light and the camera. We can use the default cube and start poly modeling. Nothing special here, just basic modeling tools to get the shape for the lamppost. We are first creating the base. You can use I to insert the face, delete the lower face and extrude the center face down. And we can switch to vertex snapping. We can move the face in the Z direction and align it to the level of the bottom vertex using Ctrl to snap. Select the two edge loops and bridge them. Then adjust the shape a little. We can duplicate the inner faces to use for the wooden part for the lamppost. Right click to leave it in place. Hit P and separate by selection and we will have a separate mesh. Just extrude and we will try to get an interesting shape for this. Now that we have something to compare to, we can adjust the size and shape of the base relative to that. Some more minor adjustments from the front view to make it look a bit more irregular and stylized. Add another cube and we can use this for the top part where the lamp will hang from. Just adjust the shape. We can create another little wooden piece to add support. Next, we can add some metal attachments. I just like to duplicate the face loops from the wood and separate them into their own mesh and just extrude them to add thickness. We can hit Alt E to extrude along face normals. Now that doesn't look right. The most common issue with this would be the scale of the object. Now as you can see, this is completely out of proportion, hence we are getting the unpredictable behavior for the extrude and will be a problem with every other tool in edit and sculpt mode. So just apply the scale and that should work normally. Add another metal part somewhere at the bottom. Now you can add more depending on the look you're going for. You can normally add it at the ends of the wood, so it will be easier as you don't have to sculpt details for that part. which is kinda hard compared to the remaining wood. By the way, similar to extrude, you can also hit Alt S to scale along normals as well. I'm just going to make some small adjustments to the shape. Now we can add some bolts to all of the places where we have joints. We can start with a cylinder with 5 sides and try to get the shape for the bolt. We can insert and delete the bottom face, as it will be covered by the mesh we place this on. For the top, we can insert that as well. And for the face in the center, I just like to right click and do poke faces. It gives us triangles, but I would rather have triangles than pentagons. To make it easy to place this, we can have the origin at the bottom so that we can snap this onto the surface. Now, I don't want it to be flush with the bottom. We can have the origin a little bit higher than the bottom of the mesh so that part of the bolt would intersect with the other mesh. Okay, that's enough for this. We can make it smaller. And on the top here, we can select face snapping. And you can hold Ctrl to snap it onto the surface. You can turn on the magnet for snapping, so that way it will always snap without holding the Control key, but I like this way better. Anyways, turn on Align Rotation to target. As you can see, it now affects the rotation of this, but it places it behind the face, facing inwards. We can try to turn on backface culling, and this time it does place it in the right orientation, but it's still placing it behind and on the face of the wooden block on the inside. This is another common issue when working with polymodeling, which is the normal orientation. We can go to the overlays and turn on face orientation, and there you can see the problem with this. Ones that are blue are fine, but everything that is red has its face normals flipped, so they are facing inwards, which is why the snapping placed the bolt on the inside. We can then select the objects that have the issue and go into edit mode. Select everything with A, hit Alt N and recalculate outside. Or you can go to mesh, normals, and you have the options here as well. Okay, with that fixed, we can turn off the face orientation in the overlays and try to place the bolt again. And for some reason it's still not working. It does work on other objects. You can try snapping it to a face in a different direction and then snap it back to the surface, and that should be placed correctly. This is just an odd behavior with snapping sometimes. Now I scale this object in edit mode, which is scaling it from the center. This will be a problem later as the origin would be in a different position. So just scale it in object mode to avoid that. And also don't apply rotation for this till you place the bolts. I made that mistake in the video and I had to fix that later. We can duplicate these and place it in different positions, but I will just do the high poly sculpt and then duplicate those to just place them to avoid sculpting details on each of the bolts separately. Next, I will probably name everything as we need to keep it organized for baking. Since we have multiple objects, we can use match by mesh name in InstaMAT to get proper bakes. With that done, we can now work on the lamp that will be hanging here. Create a new collection for that. Again, just using perimeter shapes, we can start with a circle with 6 sides, so we can have symmetry. Go into edit mode and start creating these shapes. Just going to use extrude, bevel, inset and simple scaling and move stuff around. We are going to add other parts here, so we can just leave this hole on the top open. Same thing for the bottom. We can use shade auto smooth to preview how this will look. So duplicate this for the bottom part and we can mirror invert this by scaling it on the z-axis with a value of -1. Turns out the top part has the wrong normals, so we actually corrected this by scaling it in -1. So let's just fix the top part with Alt-N and flip normals. Just make the bottom one a little bit smaller. We can duplicate the inner circle for both and separate them. With these two circles, we can right click and select Bridge Edge Loops. The bottom properties panel is covered by the screencast keys, but this also reminds me that if you accidentally click anywhere, this panel just disappears and it can get really annoying. You can hit the F9 function key to get the panel back. I'm just going to add 3 cuts. You can play with the smoothness. You can also change the profile shape. Root works well for the shape I'm going for. That should be enough topology for this, as it will just have an emission and shading won't be a big deal. Next, I will duplicate a circular face loop from the top and bottom. And we can just scale them and add thickness for some extra detail. You can select the edge strings with Ctrl Alt left click to select all of these. Then you can go to select loops and you can use edge loops. This way we have all the loops selected. Now we can bevel these. Next, duplicate one of the faces from the top and bottom that we got from the bevel. Select one that is aligned with the axis so it's possible to use symmetry later. With these two faces as one object now, we can right click and bridge faces. Just add some more loop cuts and adjust the position from the side view. Use Alt S to push this inwards. Now we can just array these around. With Blender 5.0, we have a new array modifier that is so much better than what we had in the past. You get visual controls with the array modifier, which is very nice to work with, and we can change it to circle. Since we have the origin at the center of the world, the array works correctly. We can change the count to 6. In previous versions of Blender, you had to add an empty, rotate it at an angle with respect to the count, and this way is much more intuitive. And for the bottom, I'm just trying to create some shape with the tools we used so far, like the snapping, bevel, and extrude. Now we can try to create some more detailed parts. I'm just creating a shape for the corner that we can use a circular array with. That looks good. We can array this. Since we only move this object in edit mode, the origin is still at the center, so the array is working properly. We can just duplicate this and flip it in the z-axis with a scale of -1 for the bottom part. Make sure to keep an eye on the face orientation again. For the top, we can do some kind of a chain link to attach it to the wooden post. We can use a torus for the chain links. 16 by 8 is fine. We don't need much resolution for this. Place it in the correct position. And we can use Alt-S to control the thickness. We can delete some of the faces that go inside the metal part and just adjust the shape. Now I accidentally adjusted only the right half of the mesh. So we can just delete the other half and use a mirror modifier. We can turn on clipping to make sure the words merge at the center. Since we applied the mirror modifier, we can turn on mirroring in the edit mode to affect both sides. This looks fine. We can duplicate this, flip it vertically, make sure to flip the normals as well. And also make it a bit larger as this will attach to the post. We can add another torus for the links in between, and we can array these. So adjust the shape to make it look like a chain link. Put it in position and we can add array to this. Increase the offset in z-axis. Apply the rotation so it works properly. And we can also set the Z rotation to 90 degrees to get that alternating look. That should do it for the lamp. Now just name everything properly. With all that done, just move the lamp and place it in the position to attach it to the wooden post. We have to adjust the scaling for this. Looking at the whole thing, we can make some changes to the proportion for the lamp, making it a little bit bigger. Okay, that will be it for the low poly. And I want to start working on the high poly sculpt. Now you can use a multi-resolution modifier for this and subdivide your mesh. Obviously we need to add supporting edge loops for the high poly subdivision, but I don't really like using this when I have to go really high poly, as my PC tends to get a bit laggy with the multi-res modifier. So I just manually subdivide the mesh. First, let's do it for the lamp post. I will duplicate the collection and we can set the names. To batch rename this, we can select all of these and hit Ctrl F2. With the find and replace option, we can replace the .001 with _high. So that renames all of the objects. We can also add suffixes to the low poly. So hit Ctrl F2 and this time we will choose set name here. Select suffix option and add _low to these. This is important for baking in InstaMAT, so we can match the objects by name. Now we can prepare the high poly. I'm mostly just going to bevel all these with 2 segments to add the subdivision modifiers. You can turn on the wireframe to see the topology. It will be under overlays. I just have it assigned to quick favorites, which you can do by right clicking and selecting add to quick favorites. And the same thing for these statistics, which I use regularly, and you can access them by hitting Q on the keyboard for the quick favorites menu. However, with the subd modifier, you have to turn off the optimal display to see the actual density of the mesh. Now these faces are really stretched, which is not good for sculpting. You pretty much want them to look like squares. You can add edge loops in between. It doesn't really matter that much for this, so I'm just going to add one. Anyways, I'll pretty much do this for the remaining objects. For this one, around 200,000 words is enough, and I just want to have a similar density for everything. Instead of adding another modifier, we can copy the one from earlier and all of its settings. Just select the object you want to select, the one you want to copy from last, and hit Ctrl L and copy modifiers. For the word, I'm just deselecting the inner loops and beveling those. We can then add a bevel to the loops where we need an angular bend. You can turn on the on cage option in the subdivision modifier to see it better in the edit mode. For the small wooden part, we actually don't need the end faces as they will be inside the wood. So just bevel the outer edge loops and subdivide that. Same thing for this other wood piece. Okay, now that we are done setting up the subdivision for all these, We need more geometry for the wooden pieces as they have more surface area and we will have finer details for these. Let's do the same for the lamp. Duplicate the collection and give the proper suffix for all of them. And then it's just a matter of giving the proper edge loops or bevels to support these subdivisions. I then decided to change the shape for the emissive surface and just replace the low poly. Now we have all the low poly and high poly meshes prepared and properly named, so we can move on to the sculpting part. First we can start with the large parts for the lamppost. Let's do the metal base first. Apply the subsurf modifier and we can go into the sculpt mode. For the brushes we will be using the ore brushes. The link will be in the description. If you don't know how to get them set up, you can check out my previous video on rocks and I had covered that there. We can use the ore flatten edge project to basically run that along the edges and corners to give it an organic bevel look and also some irregular damage. Now this gives a much harsher look compared to the trim brush, so I do prefer the look that we get here. Actually, since this is a symmetrical mesh, we can turn on the X and Y symmetry, and this way we can save up some time in sculpting. Then turn off symmetry to add some extra damage along the edges. Now for the metal parts, I like to use the rubble brush. Keep it at a low intensity and you can use control and push the mesh inwards. This adds that damaged look. You can turn on cavity to see this better. Now this gives an interesting look with the textures when we use the curvature map. I will subdivide this as I want more geometry to work with. And we can now add the damage. Just try to keep it random and use multiple of these for variation. Finally, let's make it a bit more rough with the flatten edge project, especially for the corners. Now we can do pretty much the same for the remaining metal parts. By the way, you can use Alt Q to switch between different objects in sculpt mode directly. This one isn't symmetrical, so we just have to sculpt it normally. Now be careful when you're sculpting the inner parts for these, as the edge project and the trim brushes can easily mess up the model near the corners. Now I know that these parts will barely be visible for this model, so I'm not being too careful with this. This should be enough for the metal parts. A lot of this will be carried by the textures, but we can definitely add more damage and stylization to this. So just experiment with the look that you want to go for. I will use the trim and edge project to give more harsher and noticeable damage and just exaggerate the details. Next, let's work on the wood. Apply the sub-D modifier. We can see if we want to add more geometry if necessary. I'm taking a large brush and trimming it at the edges. With wood, we can be a bit more random and chaotic. It's fine even if it looks a bit weird near the bends, as we want such damage for this look. Now for some details on the wood, I want to create some lines. For this we can use the Op Crack Smooth Edge. Turn on pen pressure for the size so we can vary the line width for the strokes. As you can see, we don't really have a lot of geometry to work with. This time we can try using the multi-res modifier. If you are subdividing like 5 or 6 times with the multi-res, that is when it kind of starts to get laggy. But for 1 or 2 subdivisions, it's totally fine. And that is usually when I use the multi-res for sculpting. It's a great modifier. It totally depends on the type of object you're working with and the level of detail. Well, Blender just crashed on me here. Considering we have around 850,000 words, a single subdivision should put the mesh around 2.5 to 3 million poly count. So if your computer is capable of handling that level of geometry, you can try that. But I'm just going to continue with this. Anyways, it's not a huge deal. This is a stylized piece, but there might be some artifacting near the details as we might have some stretch faces. Under stroke, we can use the stabilized stroke option. Adjust the radius and factor till you find it comfortable to draw these strokes. Okay, for me this is fine. I get the strokes without them being too shaky. Another thing I like to adjust for this specifically is the pressure curve on my pen settings. Here I have a XP pen tablet, but you might have a similar thing with whatever tablet you are working with. The only thing I'm interested in here is the hardness of the pen. Just like to make it a bit hard so the pressure curve goes down. If you barely touch the tablet with the pen, we get really thin lines, and to get thicker lines, we have to push down harder on the tablet. This way it's a bit more controlled when we draw the strokes and we don't accidentally vary the thickness when we were just trying to get a good stroke line. This is completely a personal preference. This is how I'm used to using the pen, so it might be different for you. As for the lines themselves, look at a lot of stylized wood reference. With this I'm trying to keep it as random as possible. The geometry is not that great. I would have liked to have more geometry. Maybe we could have used creases for the edges instead of bevel. So that way we would have had even density for geometry, making it easier to subdivide. But then again, it's not a big deal. If we just shade smooth, it's gonna look alright. Also, I'm just subdividing the mesh, but if you're familiar with sculpting in Blender, feel free to use the dynamic topology or remesh options. Also, you can set the size unit for the brush to scene instead of hue. With this, whether you are zoomed in or zoomed out, the brush size remains the same. You can have consistency with your lines this way. Because for stylized sculpting, especially with things like wood, if you have a thickness level for all of your lines and suddenly have a couple of cuts that are way too thin, it doesn't look that great. And with it set to view, the brush size just depends on how much you zoom in. We can change this back to view later, but for the details we can use scene. If you make any mistakes, you can use the fill or deepen brush to get back the flat surface. Now for the ends, we can use mask to add some more natural bumps. With the mask brush, just paint around the corners. Invert the mask using Ctrl I, and we can take a large grab brush to pull that out. And we can use crease and smooth tool just to shape that. We will do a similar thing for all of the corners. And for the parts in the middle, we can do a similar thing. Just mask it and pull it out to make it protrude. I will repeat the same process for the other wooden pieces. For some reason, I started to get this weird look. I'm not sure if I clicked something on my keyboard or just changed any settings. But after messing around with a couple of options, it just started working again. So I don't know, this has never happened to me before. If I were to guess, this had something to do with the spacing for the brush or the fact that I had set the size unit to scene, which I will just change it back to view a bit later. Okay, this looks good. We are pretty much close to done with this. We can go back and add some more exaggerated damage with the edge project brush to make it look even more rough. Similar to the metal parts, we can use the rubble brush, holding control to push it inwards. Not so much like dents, but just some surface damage. That should do it. Let's just shade smooth everything. Don't forget to save the file, especially for these larger scenes. We can now move on to the lamp itself. We are pretty much going to do the same thing we did for the metal parts of the lamppost. Create that natural edge damaged bevel look. Actually, since most of these are symmetrical objects, we can just turn on both X and Y symmetry to make it faster. For the convex edges, which we had so far, trim brushes work just fine, but for these concave edges, it's not that great. Instead, we can use the fill/deepen brush. This is great, and we can add that welded look. If you have a weld brush specially made for this, that would also look nice. You can also try something with the textures, but for now, this will do the job. For the chain links, we don't really need much, but we can use the edge project to flatten some of the parts. This gives it a hammered metal look. Another thing, if you have symmetry on and you are trying to flatten these kinds of corners with the trim or edge project, it will just end up smoothing it. This happens because we are trimming it from both sides and it just ends up averaging between the two planes that we are trying to flatten with and gives it a soft transition look, almost like the smooth brush. So just turn off symmetry when working on such parts. When you're sculpting any of the parts that we use the array modifier on, make sure to turn off the array modifier when sculpting, as that makes it lag quite a bit. And that should be enough for all the sculpting. Now I accidentally added some keyframes to some of these objects, so we can just expand and delete the animation data, so it won't be a problem in any way. Okay, now that we have the high poly and low poly meshes complete with all the sculpting details, it's a good time to set the proper scale for the model. This is necessary to get proper bakes, and it's also a good practice in general. I want the height for this to be close to 3 meters. Nothing exact, but we can just get it close to the height value. Add a simple cube. In edit mode, move it 1 unit in Z-axis to have it level with the floor grid. Now open up the N panel by hitting N on the keyboard, and in the item tab we have the dimensions. Right now it is 2 meters in all directions. We can just change the Z value and we can set the scale for this. It's scaling properly since we moved it up in the edit mode and the origin is at the bottom. Now we can select all the parts of the lamppost. Make sure to have the metal base as the active element, as its origin is in the center of the world. You have to change the pivot to active element, or if you don't have that, you can change the transform pivot to 3D cursor if you have that set in the correct position. Scale it down approximately to that level. Apply the scale, but don't apply the rotation like I did here. That way you can make sure that you can use snapping properly for the bolts, which I had to fix after this. So if we add 2 loop cuts, that will be 2 meters. If you consider the average human height to be around 1.7 to 1.85 meters, you can kind of estimate what this would potentially look like once you place the character in the scene. We can get rid of the cube and we have the prop at the correct scale that we want. Now to plan out how we want to divide this prop and export it. So I basically want all of these objects to share one texture space. So we will lay out the UV for all of these objects together. That way this can have its own material. Similarly, all the objects for the lamp will share the texture space and have one material for all that. This way, these two parts can be modular to get variation in the scene. We can replace the wooden post with other models of different shapes and styles, or we can have variation with the lamps, or basically different lamp with the same wooden post. With that, we can fake the idea that we don't have repetition in the scenes that we use these props in. Since we already kept track of the names for the objects, everything looks to be correct. Next thing I want to do is place the bolts across the model. So duplicate those two and move it into a new collection. Hit Shift S cursor to select it. Now this is where I noticed the mistake that I mentioned earlier. Since I scaled the object in edit mode, the origin is not in the correct position, and also somewhere along I applied the rotation. It is really important to not apply the rotation if you are planning to use the align to rotation option in snapping. So now I had to try and adjust everything properly. Since this is a stylized piece, I can kind of get away with it not having perfect rotation. So I'm just adjusting the low poly and high poly in edit mode to roughly get the proper alignment. This is a really small part, so it's not that noticeable if we have some mistakes. In fact, sometimes with stylized pieces, mistakes tend to make it look better as it adds some imperfections. I just wanted to include this part if any of you accidentally made the same mistake that I made. Now for placing this, I'm just taking an empty at the same position as the bolts using the 3D cursor. We can hold shift and drag and drop the two objects under the empty. This will make the empty the parent for the two objects we dropped under it. You can also select the three objects and select the empty at last. Hit Ctrl P and you can select the set parent to object option. We can change the snapping to face and turn on align rotation to target. Now it is rotating in a wrong direction, but we can simply just rotate the objects 90 degrees in the correct orientation. The alignment is not perfect as we have bumps in the high poly. Since there are different normal direction for all of those faces, just hide the high poly when trying to snap and that should work properly now. So I will just duplicate these and place them where I want them to be. Again, you can vary them in scale or have a different perpendicular rotation. Now we can just select all of these meshes without selecting the empties. Hit Alt P to clear parent and keep transform. This way the bolts will preserve the rotation and location after being unparented. Delete all the empties, we don't need them now. We can just combine all the bolts as one object. So use Ctrl J to join all the low poly objects and the high poly objects respectively. Now we have all the low poly bolts as one object and all the high poly bolts as another. And we can just place them in the right collection. With the low poly, we can match the ends of the wood closer to the high poly as we made a lot of changes there. So go into edit mode and you can turn on retopology in the overlays to see the high poly underneath. And we can use face snapping to make it follow the shape better. You can add more geometry here by adding some cuts for the corner extrusions, but for this case it's not really necessary. For some final adjustments to the low poly, we can add some bevels before we move on to unwrapping. Even though we will set shade smooth and have the normals from the high poly, I don't like the sharp look we get from all these harsh angles. And we can just add a single bevel. It does make a lot of difference. We can also do it with a modifier just to be safe if we want to fall back later. Add the bevel modifier, set the limit mode to weight. Select all the objects and we can link that modifier using Ctrl L. Turn off free topology in overlays. Now in the end panel, under item we have the option for the mean bevel weight value for the edges, and we can set that to 1 for the selected edges. You have to adjust the bevel amount. Now just copy the modifier again since we changed the value. Now it's simply a matter of selecting each object and setting which edges you want to be beveled. We can do the same thing for the lamp as well. Alright, this is a point where we can save the file as we will be applying the modifiers for unwrapping. So that way you can fall back to the previous version if you want to make any large changes, or just append the objects that you might want to edit later from the previous file. Just select everything and hit Ctrl A and select Visual Geometry to Mesh. This will apply any modifiers and convert it into actual geometry. So now the lamp itself is around 7.5k triangles. If you didn't do the bevels, it could have been around 4000 tries, so that depends on if you want to use this for something that is very optimized and resource limited projects. Let's apply everything for the wooden post as well. Lastly, for the high poly, you can export it like this if you have a fast system, but I just like to decimate everything to get a lower poly count. Now if we do it to a certain level, we won't really lose any details, but this can improve the baking times by a lot. Now when I first tried to bake this model, I had around 13 million tries in total. I was able to get the baking done, but that took a really long time. So decimating this to around 3 million polys made it much easier to work with. But you can also bake the lamp and wooden post separately in 2 different projects, so that will reduce the poly count by a fair amount, but for this case we will just decimate it. Apply all the array modifiers. Now we can start adding the decimate modifiers. Be careful with this as Blender occasionally tends to crash with using the decimate with really high poly count, and just reduce it until you start losing any detail. After decimating all the objects, we have around 2.5 million tries in total for all the high poly objects. This should be much easier to bake, and we didn't really lose any of the details. With that, all of the objects are ready and we have everything named properly. So that just leaves us with unwrapping the low poly and exporting the objects for texturing. So for the unwrapping, let's start with the wooden post. Since this is facing this way, I want to put the seams on the back. So even if there are any noticeable texture cuts near the seam, it won't be an issue. That's the whole idea. Just have it so these seams are going to be away from the camera or player as much as possible. So select the edge loops you want to add the seam to. You can hit right click and select mark seam. I just have it assigned to quick favorites as well. So if I just remove it, you can right click on any of the operations and add it to quick favorites. Then you can access them by hitting Q and you have all the options that you added to your quick favorites menu in edit mode. Quick favorites are unique to each mode, so you can set different ones for edit mode, sculpt mode, or object mode, or any of the others. With the seam set, we can select everything and hit U for unwrap and select angle based. And as long as you have all the seams set properly, you will have proper UV islands. So I'm just going to quickly do it for the rest. You can try to follow along or just try to put your own seams. It's not too complicated. If you know how to unwrap cylinders, we pretty much use that idea for most of the parts. Also, if it's annoying to see the seams with the bevel weights we added earlier, you can turn that off under the overlays. Alright, we have all the parts for the wooden post unwrapped. We just need to pack everything so there are no overlaps and we are not wasting any texture space. You can just select everything, go to UV and pack islands. Blender should give you a good pack without wasting much space. But that way it also scatters everything randomly, and I like to keep my UVs organized, so I do it manually. For this I like to use the add-on Mio 3 UV. This is available in extensions. So open up preferences, under get extensions search for the Mio 3 UV add-on and you can get that installed. This adds a lot of nice operations that help you organize and edit the UVs. So I will just try to fix these islands so they can be packed neatly. Let's do one after the other. You can hit 4 to activate the UV island selection mode. This is a toggle. With this you can click anywhere in the island and it will select everything connected regardless of whether you're in edge, face or vertex select modes. And you can go ahead and use tools like Gridify or any of the alignment or the sort functions. I will just do it for the rest. Now all of this is completely optional and up to your preferences. So you can just do an automatic pack if you are not interested in the UVs. For me, however, I like to have my UVs organized and readable as I tend to reuse the textures and models sometimes, and I like to use image editors when I do that. If your UV layout is completely scattered with small pieces, it's really hard to figure out what corresponds to which part. So at the very least, I want different parts to be together. So for example, have all the metal parts packed together and have the wooden parts packed together separately. Once you have everything to the correct shapes, you can select all of these, go to edit mode, select everything at once, and you can hit the average Allen scale option. This makes it so all the parts share the correct amount of texture space depending on the size in the 3D view. So now it's just a matter of arranging them. Again, you can do the pack Allen and you can get a pretty good and optimal pack and just be done with it. But I will just do it manually. It won't be perfect or optimal, but I prefer this as it makes it much easier for me later down the line when I want to make any edits. Alright, I completed the UVs for the lamp as well. This is what the final layout looks like. You can definitely get a better pack, but this will work for this model. Now depending on how you want to work with this, you can have two separate texturing projects, one for the lamp and one for the wooden post. For this we will have a single project and separate these using materials. So let's add a new material, call it lamp structure. And we can assign that to all of these parts as they share the UV layout for the texture space. Hit Ctrl L and link materials. Same idea, create a material for the lamps as well and assign that. So now we can go ahead and export everything. One file for the low poly and one for the high poly. Before we do that, select everything, right click and hit Shade Smooth. That way we won't have any sharp edges for the low poly or any artifacts on the high poly. We already have everything named properly with _low and _high. Just double check that once. Select all the low poly objects. I have the FBX export option assigned to a quick favorite, or you can just go to File, Export and select FBX. Just save that. Make sure to have selected objects, so only the ones we have selected will be exported. We don't have any animation data and also no modifiers, so we won't worry about that, and hit export. Do the same for the high poly. That will be all for this video. In the next part, we will see how to create the textures for this in InstaMAT. So if you're interested in that, you can subscribe to the channel so you can catch that video. Anyways, thank you for watching.